All right, let's talk about one of the most powerful tools in a manager's arsenal: direct labor variances. You know that feeling when you look at the numbers and see your costs have blown past the budget? Well, this is your roadmap to figuring out exactly why. So, let's start digging. We're going to tackle this like a real detective story. First, we'll look at the main problem. Then we'll get our toolkit ready to decode all the clues. After that, we'll do a first breakdown to find our initial suspects. And then we'll dig even deeper. We'll wrap it all up with a super fast review of every formula you need to know. So let's set the scene. Imagine you're running a business. Let's say it's a custom t-shirt printing shop. You've planned your budget, you know exactly what your labor costs should be, but then the month-end report lands on your desk and it tells a very, very different story.
And this is the classic headache for any manager, right? You just see this big negative number on a spreadsheet that says you overspent. But that number doesn't really tell you anything useful on its own. Did you pay your people more per hour? Were they working slower than expected? Was there some kind of downtime? You need details. And that's exactly where our investigation kicks off, with the direct labor total variance. You calculate it by taking your standard cost, that's your planned hours times your planned rate, and subtracting your actual cost, which is the hours you actually paid for times the rate you actually paid. This just gives you the big picture, the total size of your problem. It confirms that you have a problem, but it doesn't tell you why. Now, before we can start breaking down that total variance, we have got to make sure we're all speaking the same language. You know, in variance analysis, being precise is everything. So let's get our key terms locked down. Think of these as the essential tools for our investigation. This table really helps make these abstract terms feel real. So SH, or standard hours, that's the perfect world time you budgeted. Now pay attention here. AH with the asterisk is super important. It's the hours you actually paid for. But AH hash with the hash mark, that's the hours your team was actually working. SR is your planned wage, and AR is what you ended up paying. Seriously, getting these terms straight is half the battle. And this right here is probably the most important distinction we're going to make. Actual hours paid versus actual hours worked. Think about it. An employee could be on site for a full 8-hour shift. But what if the screen printing machine gets jammed for an hour? You've still paid for 8 hours, but you only got 7 hours of actual productive work. That 1-hour gap, that's what we call idle time. And trust me, it's a critical clue. All right, with our toolkit all set, we can now take that big, scary total variance number and start breaking it apart. We're going to split it into 3 core pieces that will give us much, much clearer answers. Let's start interrogating the evidence. First up is the rate variance. This one is simple. It isolates just one variable, the price you paid for labor. The formula compares your planned rate to your actual rate and multiplies that by the hours you paid for. So back in our t-shirt shop, if this variance is negative, it might mean we had to pay unexpected overtime to finish a rush order. Or maybe we had to use a more senior and therefore more expensive staff member than we originally planned. Next, we've got the idle time variance. This variance directly tackles that gap between hours paid and hours worked that we just talked about. The formula is easy. You just take the number of idle hours and multiply it by your standard rate. So if that t-shirt printer jam caused 1 hour of downtime, this variance puts a price tag on that lost time. It's brilliant for isolating problems like machine failures, waiting for materials, or just bad scheduling. Now listen up, because this is a major point, especially for your SCPMP exams. You have to separate out idle time. Why? Well, think about it. It's not the worker's fault if a machine breaks down. If you just lump that lost hour into their general efficiency score, you're not only being unfair, but more importantly, you're hiding the real root cause of the problem from management. This gives you a true, honest picture of your team's efficiency. And that leads us perfectly into the final piece of this first breakdown, the efficiency variance. See, now that we've pulled out the issues with pay rates and idle time, this variance gives us a pure measure of productivity. It compares the standard hours you should have taken for the job against the hours you actually worked. So if our t-shirt shop hired a couple of new trainees, we'd probably see a negative variance here, simply because they took a bit longer than the standard time to get the job done. But hold on. What if your team isn't just one type of worker? What if you've got a mix of senior designers, junior printers, and maybe an apprentice? In that case, a single overall efficiency number might still be hiding some really important details. Our investigation has to go one level deeper. And that brings us to the mix variance. Its whole job is to figure out the cost impact of using a different combination of labor than you planned. For example, let's say your plan was to use 1 senior designer and 3 junior printers. But on the day, you actually used 2 seniors and 2 juniors. The mix has changed. This variance tells you the exact cost of that specific change in your team's composition. In this case, it would probably be a negative variance because that second senior designer costs more. And finally, we have the yield variance. Now, after you've accounted for the change in the mix, this variance tells you whether that actual group of workers was more or less productive than expected. It measures the pure output, or yield, from the hours they put in. So let's go back to our example. Even if our mix of 2 seniors and 2 juniors was more expensive, what if they were so good that they produced way more t-shirts than the standard outlet? Well, that would give us a favorable yield variance. Okay, our investigation has uncovered all the clues. Now, to make sure this all sticks in your brain, let's do a final, high-speed review of every single formula, your complete detective's toolkit. Ready? First up, the total variance. This is your big picture view, what you plan to spend versus what you actually spent. Next, the rate variance. This one isolates the price. Did you pay more or less per hour than you planned? Then, the idle time variance. This is the cost of unproductive time. How much did downtime cost you? The efficiency variance. This is your pure productivity measure. Did your team work faster or slower than expected? The mix variance. This calculates the cost of using a different combination of staff. And finally, the yield variance. This measures the actual output you got from that specific team mix. And that brings us to the end. But remember this, calculating these variances isn't the end goal. It's just the beginning. The numbers tell you where to look and what questions to ask. So now that you know why your costs were over budget, what are you, as the manager, actually going to do about it? The investigation is over. The real work begins now.